Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Well, lots, of course, been going on in American politics. We've had Joe Biden, who has been officially inaugurated as the president of the United States. He is now the president. But yet, it's important to also look back, right, at Donald Trump and his legacy. He's left office with just a 34% approval rating, the lowest rating of his entire term. And on the final day of his office, he hailed his achievements. He hailed the America First campaign that he waged, saying that the movement that he started is just the beginning of that movement at this point. President Biden now has already essentially signed a number of orders rolling back things like the Paris Accord, the fact that the U.S. walked away from the Paris Accord, that is. The U.S. is now aiming to be back into the Paris Climate Accord, as well as a host of other issues, talking about the travel ban, the Muslim ban as it's known as well, revoking that. So there's a lot on the table that has happened. But yet, Donald Trump's legacy and Trumpism, if I may use that term, will remain, will it not? Let's discuss all of that with our guests who are joining us today. We're joined now by Dr. Sharon, who is professor of political science at the University of Florida. She's also editor of the American Political Science Review. She's joining us this morning from Middleburg, Florida. Joining us from Baltimore, Maryland is Dr. Robert Koulish, who is director of Law programs. He's professor of government and politics and lecturer at law at the University of Maryland. And joining us from Newark, Delaware is Dr. David Redlawsk, who is a James R. Soules professor and chair, Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Delaware. David, Robert, and Sharon, good morning to all three of you, and thank you for joining us. David, let me start with you. Let's start with Trump's legacy, if we can. What is his legacy? Is it that, do you think that he's sparked this honest, if I may call it, white supremacist notion, which is very, very public and unapologetic in its expression?
I think a key part of his legacy is that he's brought this, what you just say, this white supremacy out from the closet, as it were. Before he started running, we knew this was there, but we didn't really have a good sense of the scope or its impact on American politics. Since he's been president, right-wing white nationalism in particular has been emboldened. And I think that's a key part of his legacy. Whether that continues or not depends an awful lot on how we respond over the following years.
All right. So then, Sharon, how and what do you think needs to be done in response to that? I mean, do you think Joe Biden, for example, is well placed to deal with that situation?
I think so. I think I agree that white supremacy has always been there. These white nationalist groups have always been active, but they felt empowered under Donald Trump. And as a result of him no longer being in office, these groups are still going to be active. But I think that especially with the incident that recently happened at the Capitol, that was a wake-up call to a lot of people in America that these groups need to be watched really, really carefully and that they shouldn't be taken for granted. So I think the Biden administration is very much aware of that, and he is very much equipped to handle it.
Robert, Donald Trump himself saying that the movement I've begun it's only just beginning right now. That's sort of an ominous thing to say, right? I mean, are we in for a lot more at this time, do you think?
Yeah, it's my understanding that we're in for a long period of time where the country is going to remain very, very polarized and very, very divided. I think that even President Biden's call for an end to uncivil war yesterday was really recognizing the fact that the country has never been as polarized since the Civil War. Now, as former President Trump left, there was writing that he's already thinking about a third party, a patriot party, to continue the movement. Majority of the people in this country have never been important to Trump. Trump, as president, never went over 50% in the public opinion polls. He received a minority of the popular vote in 2016 and 2020. What he woke up was a fissure of white supremacy that's been in this country since 1419. So it's been here for 400 years. For the past generation or two, this is a group of people and a thread of the narrative that has been to mix metaphors, has been under the rocks. And what he did is he turned that rock. These people he's given them air to breathe. He's given them legitimacy. They're not going anywhere, unfortunately. And as to your question of whether or not the new administration is capable of addressing it, yeah. I think they're as capable as any administration to address these issues. And I think that there'll be investigations at the level of the Justice Department and the FBI, Department of Homeland Security. But I think that we're talking about something that is representing the thoughts, interests, and values of millions of people in this country, and I think it remains to be seen how it gets dealt with anytime soon.
David, I was in Houston, Texas just yesterday, and I was just, there's many things that we can obviously pick on that as far as issues between the divide of left versus right in the country, right, in the U.S. But just on the issue, for example, of the pandemic, there isn't widespread following of SOPs in Texas, and even schools are open largely. A lot of that stuff, I imagine, is very different in more left-leaning states, but that sort of divide, that's very hard to overcome, right? I mean, those are huge challenges where if people are even politicizing something as simple and serious, of course, as a pandemic, what hope is there for other issues?
Right. No, I think that's a really important point. The reason, of course, that we have it politicized is that the now former administration basically politicized it, and in doing so, in states with Republican governors, they followed along with the messages they were getting from President Trump. The difference, of course, is now we're going to get a very different message, a message that I think is carried forward with concern and empathy in a way that may really connect with more people. If you look at polling on mitigation and how you should approach it, the large majority of Americans actually support things like mask wearing and what have you, but there's a lot of social pressure not to do it as well because it was coming from the very top. I think we're going to see a little bit of a different world, but we're also going to see much more of a laser focus on trying to address this. Reports out this morning suggest that the Trump administration actually had no plan whatsoever for the distribution of the vaccine. I think the Biden administration is going to have to come in and make clear to the American public exactly what we have to do and how we have to move forward. There will certainly be elements that will not support that, but I think the tone at the top matters. And as the tone at the top matters, it opens up the possibility that more people are going to respond in the appropriate ways to this crisis, and we may manage to get through it.
One of the concerns I would think, Sharon, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that it is possible to go very extreme on the left as well, right? Against this movement, if it's fair to call that, this Trumpism movement. How does one find a balanced approach to it? Because it's not like all conservative ideals are wrong, or all Republicans' ideals are wrong, or all things that the Republicans would want to stand up for are wrong. I mean, many of them are actually very correct, and I would imagine a lot of citizens of the U.S. would agree with. So how does one, not go overboard in that regard? Because I get the feeling sometimes for watching the likes of, certain channels in the U.S., even while I was there, that it was night and day about the approach between Republicans and Democrats, and that seems like it's very hard to bridge that gap.
It is very hard to bridge that gap. And then also that's just one of the problems for the Biden administration, in the sense that the progressive wing of the party has views that are totally different from the moderate wing of the party. And so just in the same sense that the Republicans have a lot of soul searching to do because of the presence of Donald Trump and now his absence, I think the Democrats have a lot to sort of contend with as well, in the sense that progressives want one thing, but moderates want something that's completely different. And with this pandemic, because we have never dealt with anything like this in our lifetimes, this is a time in which Americans are going to have to come together and come up with a solution because, simply put, people are dying, not just here, but all over the world. And I think that Joe Biden has an approach, and even before he was inaugurated yesterday, he was pretty much laying out the things that he wanted to do. He really wanted to heavily encourage people to wear masks. And I think that because this is so serious and because this pandemic has dragged on much longer than any of us expected it to, as a result of that, regardless of whether someone is a liberal or a conservative, I think the politicians are going to have to come together and come up with some solutions, because I think the public is going to demand it.
So then, Robert, do you think that Biden has the kind of across-the-board appeal, though, with Republicans? Because Donald Trump, at least during his tenure and even the end of it, a lot of the Republicans sided with him really till the end, even though some of them, especially after the Capitol riot, did speak out against him, too. I mean, it seems confusing. Do you think the Republicans will be a lot more reconciliatory, if that's the right word, right now with Democrats?
Well, I think that what Biden is doing right now, I agree, is the right thing. He's showing a lot of competence, a lot of expertise, a lot of experience. You see that around the people that he's surrounding himself with, and with the, I think, 17 executive orders that were issued on his first day. He has a 10-day plan that's going to involve executive orders and legislation. He's willing to work with Democrats and Republicans, which is what his want, and as he talks about unity. But I don't think he's naive. I think that he's actually going to run a progressive presidency, and it's going to be a presidency with the surprising support of moderate and more progressive Democrats. He may not use the language of more progressive Democrats, but it certainly looks from his early agenda that he's going to be moving in that direction, dealing with climate change, dealing with COVID, dealing with social justice, racial justice issues. I think the people around him are very smart to move in this direction. I think practice and action works much more than words. In terms of reaching out and getting Republican support, I think that it would be naive to think that many of the Republicans that blockaded and negated the Obama administration in 2009, who are still there now running the Senate, for example, are going to suddenly turn around and support a Biden administration. But I think that the people around him are smart enough and informed enough to know how to get things done with the bare bones majority that they do have in the Senate and with the slim majority that they have within the House of Representatives. So I'm bullish. I see an active and vital Biden administration that's going to move in a New Deal sort of way. And it will carry a lot of the Democrats with him and some of the more moderate Republicans. I think the vast number of Republicans will be doing what they can to be in the opposition and to pursue their own interests in terms of running for higher office in 2024, 2022. But he needs to ignore them, as he has said, and just get on with business. There is so much to be done.
All right, so let's talk about those executive orders then, right? So we've had the orders vis-a-vis the Muslim ban, as it's known, immigration advocates welcoming that. He's also spoken, Biden, that is, about, revoking Donald Trump, many of his immigration policies, that is, even at the Mexico border. The wall, I believe, will not now be built to the extent that Trump had wanted it to. He's going to rejoin the climate deal, WHO, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's 17, I believe, as an earlier guest there mentioned, orders that were signed. What I'm confused about is that from one president to another, when handover of power occurs, I mean, does it look good on the U.S. to have then a president come in and just basically rubbish everything a previous president's done? I mean, that sort of seems like every 4 years, if that, theoretically, then you can just have extremely different policies. I mean, shouldn't there be some level of continuity or a step-by-step process instead of working towards what one's policies are?
But the system we have with the kind of executive power we have, especially in the context of foreign policy, really does lend itself to exactly what you just said, that if you change ideology substantially from one president to another, you can have this sort of whiplash on American foreign policy. It's pretty much what happened when Trump came in and his efforts to overturn literally anything that Obama had done. To some degree, Biden is resetting back to many of the Obama-era policies, or at least versions of those policies. I think that the message for the rest of the world from the United States on this is, I think Biden's hope is that the message is that Trump was an aberration, that Trump's approach to the world, his America first, his withdrawal from active participation in many aspects of world affairs, is not something that will happen going forward, that we're back in that sense. I think that's one of the reasons for prioritizing these particular executive orders. But it is potentially, of course, if we elect another Trumpist-type president, that we can see these wild swings. It's not particularly great for our position in the world. And historically, we haven't seen quite as much of this because foreign policy was one of the things on which there was historically a lot of bipartisan agreement. There'd be disagreement around the edges, but not in the big picture. Whether we'll ever get back to that kind of an environment where things don't swing so dramatically from one administration to another, I don't know. But on foreign policy, this is just the nature of our system. Presidents have a great deal of power to act without the legislature, without Congress. And President Biden is clearly going to take advantage of that.
I'll give you the final word before I let all three of you go. Foreign policy, then, as David there correctly mentioned. So, I mean, I can pick on one major foreign policy issue, and that is the Iran nuclear deal. And just, do you think that there will be a confusion in that regard, too, from the Iranian side? Because, again, we're looking from this outside in, right? And Donald Trump walked away from the deal. Biden says he wants in on the deal. Who's to say what will happen with 4 years down the line? I mean, this is really confusing for countries outside.
Right. It's very confusing in the sense that, I mean, you've got two presidents who were polar opposites. Donald Trump was more, I guess some people would call him a war hawk. Some people were very suspicious of him, especially during those final days that he was in office. Joe Biden is a totally different type of president. But I also think that we don't need to think of Joe Biden as being, I guess, too liberal or too soft, because I think when it comes to both domestic and foreign policy, he has views in some ways that might even be similar to those of Donald Trump. So it's really hard to predict how he's going to act on either the domestic front or the foreign policy front.
We'll leave that as a final comment, but we appreciate all three of our guests, Sharon, Robert, and David, for sharing their opinions with us. And of course, we're taking their time out to speak to us here in Scope, discussing there Donald Trump leaving office, his legacy, 34% approval rating. Again, not a great number to have right when you're leaving office. Will Trumpism live on? Will it come back in some ways with Donald Trump either launching a political party or even a media organization, as he had spoken of much earlier on, also when it was clear that he had lost the elections? Will Biden be able to reverse many of these things? I mean, he has signed those executive orders, but is that how we want U.S. presidents to lead, just by executive orders, canceling what the previous one has done, walking away from nuclear deals and rejoining them, walking away from climate change deals, rejoining them? I mean, this back and forth, the zigzag, the swing, this pendulum, it makes for very confusing, especially foreign policy making, and certainly even for domestic policies as well, and something that we're going to keep a very close eye on here in Scope, of course, for you all. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss France, and we've discussed Islamophobia in France quite a number of times on my show. But in this segment, we're going to discuss the fact that a lot of international organizations have gotten together and have complained to the United Nations, saying that it needs to now get involved regarding how France treats its own Muslim citizens and France's relations with its own Muslims as well, saying that essentially France has structural Islamophobia, that it's ensuring that is engraving that within its system. And there is, of course, discrimination against Muslims, as, again, I've said we've discussed before on this show. The organizations make the point that all of this is against international law as well. And that, of course, would be a key point. Does this then mean that France will be or should be held accountable in any way, shape, or form when it comes to international law and its respect or lack of in that regard as well? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. And I'm joined by Dr. Greg Barton, who is joining us this evening from Melbourne. He's a professor of global Islamic politics at Deakin University. Joining us from Paris, France, is Abdennour Toumi, who is a North Africa expert at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, known as ORSAM. And we're joined from Marseille by Dr. Raphael Liogier, who is a professor of the sciences politics, visiting researcher at Columbia University. He's also teacher at the International College of Philosophy and researcher at Sophia-Pol. Raphael, Abdennour, and Greg, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Raphael, let me start with you. What do you make of the United Nations Human Rights Council possibly getting involved in this case? Is this appropriate at this time?
I think not only that it's appropriate, I think it's a necessity, and I think it could help my country, it could help France to see itself how it actually is, because we are pretending that we are the country of human rights, but we just forbid by a government act, for instance, an NGO that is a human rights NGO to protect Muslims, the CCIF, and other measures, other things, other actions. So I think it would be interesting that France could see herself through the lens of international law, international views. You know, I think it would be good for my country, actually. So I think it's a necessity.
Greg, what are your thoughts on that? Because, you know, we have the likes of France, which then look at other governments around the world and would say that, listen, you don't treat your minorities right, but then you have to lead by example, don't you?
You do, and I think Raphael really hits the key point, which is helping France see itself as it really is. I mean, I'm speaking from outside of France, but, you know, speaking to French colleagues and friends who work on France, there's a blind spot. There's a failure to understand that what France is doing with these policies is contrary to its very basic principles. It's very proud of its basic principles with good reason, but what it can't see is how these are in contradiction with them. And France has changed over the years. It needs to understand it needs to allow more space in society for plurality. People can be distinctive and have their own way of doing things and yet still be absolutely French. And that's what that's the struggle for France to understand. It's a conceptual struggle, a self-understanding problem.
You know, Abdennour, the argument that, as you know, Macron had put forward not too long ago was that the Western media and the Western world did not understand France's realities on the ground, that it was not, in fact, that his policies were not, in fact, Islamophobic, that he was not anti-Islam in any way. He even sent his foreign minister, I believe, to a number of Arab countries to convince them in that regard. What are your thoughts about that? Because I would think that then at the United Nations, France would put the same argument forward.
Actually, by the way, good afternoon, and thank you for having me, and thank you to give us this opportunity to discuss this thorny issue. Actually, the issue of Islam in France has become a serious, enters into vicious circle. And just, I mean, historically speaking, I mean, the domestication of Islam in France is not new. I'm sure your guest, Professor Liogier, will know that this, goes back to the late 19th century with the instauration of the Third Republic, and then led to the early 20th century to the establishment of the separation between religions and the state. But as far as the question of Islam in France has been, as I stated in previous shows, going on for the last, I would say, 30 years, but it started actually in the early 2002 with the socialist government under Jean-Pierre Chevènement, who was the interior minister and also in charge of the religions. But lately, as you asked about President Macron's perception of France, perceptions in outside or in the world, actually there is a misunderstanding. I think what France is trying to do, actually when I speak about France, the French officials and this government is trying to hide all its failures, domestic failures, geopolitics, on the issue of Islam. But the important element here in this story is also the role of the Muslim community. actually. And then when I speak about Muslim community, I put it in plural, in Muslim communities. And we just saw this disagreement of the CFCM, and there are already 3 federations who are not going, or who said they will not sign the new charter that the National Council of Imams.
Right.
So the question, it's purely ideological more than for public policies and looking forward for a solution with the Muslim communities here in France.
Raphael, do you think in some ways that such pressure, when it's coming from the outside in, might actually backfire, in the sense that, I mean, I get the feeling, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the French do not like outside pressure in this regard. I mean, as I put to Abdennour, Macron did not respond very well or react very well to the criticism from international media, for example.
No, it's true. It doesn't react very well because there is this obnoxiousness that is not only a myth, that is reality in France. But I think it's a good thing anyway, because it's the only way for us, I mean, to awake from our fantasy about Islam. Because what I want to say, what is very important, it is that it's true that we have always tried to to control Islam and all that, and there was some kind of an Islamophobia right from the 19th century, but things have changed over 2002, 2003. There is a reversal of tides now, because it's from 2002 and 2003, it doesn't have the same nature. It's more of some kind of, now I will say, a paranoid structure. So when we are talking about Islam, we are more talking about our own identity crisis. And so we're not really talking about a real Islam. It's becoming really the fear, the idea, the anxiety that we have lost our position in the global world, in what we were before, etc., etc. And it's what we see. So now, when people are talking about Muslims, they are not talking about people that they despise in a way, the way they were doing it in the 80s. They are talking about people they don't despise, but they fear, which is much worse. Because it's like if the people that we have colonized before, they are now colonizing ourselves. So there is a change, a clinical change. And so that's the reason why the law is becoming violent, and there is some kind of it's to get out of this situation, because paranoia make you blind. It's what is happening now in France. It's the only way is the outside. It's called, in political science, we call that the boomerang effect. It's like it comes back to your face from the outside. And I think it's necessary to awaken us now.
All right, so then, Greg, how does one go about doing this correctly from the outside in then, right? Because we have these 36 organizations, I believe there's 37 now. An organization, I believe, in New Zealand has just signed on over the past number of hours too. That's the latest update that I saw. So 37 or more organizations around the world who have expressed concern about what's happening in France. How does one effectively encourage change from the outside, and especially in a country which, is nationalistic, of course, A, and B, is proud of its, its values, its stated values of, secularism, etc.?
Well, I think it's a big challenge. It's obviously not easy. We can't pretend it's easy. My concern is that we get results which bring about real benefits and change for the people of France, including the 6 or so million French Muslims. So just berating the French government or the French state and getting their back up isn't going to be productive. It's hard today not to think of the words of now President Joe Biden talking about, in the case of America, which has a problem with right-wing extremism, of appealing to the better angels of the American nature. And I think we want to do the same thing with France, which also has a problem with right-wing extremism, which is part of the problem here. Macron, I think, give him the benefit of the doubt, means well, but he is acting partly out of ignorance and partly out of fear of the right. And the challenge is how to encourage him and his colleagues to rise to their better natures, to recognize the problem, not to take it as an insult, not to feel like victims, but to find a solution. And oddly enough, as terrible as the last 4 years in the US have been, today there's a sense of hope there, and that might point the way for the rest of the world. I include in that Australia too, by the way, that we need to find a way to recognise diversity and recognise that we're imperfect and we've got problems to address, including, as President Biden pointed out in his inauguration address, right-wing extremism and right-wing terrorism, the people who led an insurrection at the US Capitol. It's not a uniquely American problem. It's a problem that France is facing as well as is Australia, and that's part of the problem we're dealing with here.
So then, Abdennour, you're sitting in Paris right now. What are people around you saying, people you speak to saying about the international community's role in what happens in France? I mean, does this even have an impact, or does this in fact solidify positions in the country?
I think, as our colleagues stated it, I mean, it's important to let France feel the heat by getting these critics from outside. But to be frank with you, I mean, domestically, especially the media, the elite, and the political parties, unfortunately, I mean, there are only, let's say, maybe take a side of some left parties who are a little bit nuanced on the issue. But it feels like there is a consensus on this issue, actually, when it comes to Islam, because the idea of, or the imperative of Islam has changed. And again, I stated earlier, or in previous shows, I mean, it moved in the 70s and 80s from an ethnic issue that back then it was the target, the Arabs and the lazies who are here in France just to take advantage from France's social programs. But in the 2000s and recent years, has moved into a religious aspect. And it's very, very important for the political parties, because there is no right, no left. There is only the extremists. And it's sad to say this in France of Mitterrand, de Gaulle, Giscard d'Estaing, Chirac, even Seguin, Jospin, it was a political debate. But in these days, there is no debate on these issues. So, and President Macron himself, he knows well, actually he's betting very, very, he's actually hammering on this issue very hard, that will lead him to a runoff in 2022 with Marine Le Pen. I think this scenario is not going to happen because for other French domestic politics. So, but again, the Muslims on the other hand, I mean, again, they are living their life quietly. And again, these days there are these measures of the semi-lockdown, a curfew, whatever. So the mosques are closed because of the pandemic. But on the other hand, they are so far they are so quiet. They are not saying anything. But I believe after the pandemic, the whole thing will pops up and will hit very hard on the government. And as Professor Liogier said it's a boomerang effect, and this will hit President Macron himself and his policies, and notably his right-wing ideologues who are pushing for this. It's not because looking for a solution, but just because of the ideology. And then we just saw in this so-called law proposal to enhance the French Republic values, and we saw the Minister Schiappa and Congresswoman Berger, who just, again, when one reads their statement, it's purely ideological and has nothing to do with a solution and how to approach this thorny issue with the public policies. Sure, there are some national security imperatives, but these imperatives, they need to be taken care by the intelligence service and not by politicians.
Well, in my introduction, I'd said that a lot of these countries, and we're talking about France, of course, today, they have this exceptional view of themselves, right, as having moral authority over all other countries. And certainly there is no country on earth which is perfect, and everybody has issues in the way they deal with their respective minorities. But, do you think that this sort of shatters that facade, that, that France is also in a moral position in regards to how it treats its citizens? And then what does that then mean mean going forward about the view the rest of us should have about the country?
I think there is this cognitive dissonance, this deep cognitive dissonance in France between, on one side, the fact that we represent ourselves as being the country of human rights in the face of the world, and the fact that we actually don't really implement those principles quite well, especially for the last few years. But there is something very important I would like to say. It is that, in fact, because I know the President Macron advisor, I knew them before he tried to become president of France, and I know himself. I've met him, and I haven't talked to him about that, but I know about his advisor and people that are around him. That, to say the truth, he doesn't care much about Islam. For him, it is not a problem. It has never been a problem for him. When it wasn't in his program, he's very liberal from that point of view. He doesn't think that Muslim people deep inside himself, threaten French sovereignty or culture or anything of that kind. And you can see that in first time, up to we'll say until October 2020, when there was a terrorist attack. Before that, until then, he didn't really he didn't really address this as a problem. But after that, he felt that he couldn't do otherwise, not because he thinks it's a real problem, because the real problem is in his own party and people around, and this global, this collective anxiety in France, like we are losing our identity, etc. And he saw that he had to address it. Otherwise, he will not be re-elected. It's not only against Marine Le Pen. Otherwise, he will not be re-elected. And so he had to address it. And so, what is he doing now? It doesn't work, I think. He's trying to anticipate, to do even more than what is asked for him. Do you know why? Because he anticipates, so he thinks that doing that, people will leave him doing what he thinks is very important. It means economically transform France, etc., etc. But it doesn't work, because in the same time, there is also international, relations, other countries that don't understand what is happening, etc., etc. So he's in the middle of this. But his real conviction, I tell you, he doesn't really care. He cares about Europe, he cares about economy and all that, but he doesn't care. He's just pushed by people, and now he realized he can't be elected if he doesn't address it. That's all. That's the only thing, in fact.
Raphael, they brought up two very important points I wanted to get your thoughts on. This idea that it is now politically smart in many, many countries to be in some ways Islamophobic, if not outright, then in some, indirect ways, A. And then B, about the identity of many of these countries, right? We're talking about largely Judeo-Christian countries, Christian mostly, in fact, and they want to preserve that identity, that be it white identity or however we want to term it. And that is certainly in danger, considering a lot of these countries are made up of vast numbers of immigrants who are important citizens, contributing citizens, have been there for generations, etc. What are your thoughts about both of those issues?
Look, I think those are really important and very real points. I think part of the challenge is making the point that we should rise, as I said, to the better angels of our nature. This is not what France is about. This is not what America is about. It's not what Australia is about. That's the first point. Secondly, in political language, yes, there is short-term advantage. It's expedient to pander to the right. But in the long term, it's very dangerous. It's destructive to our societies and communities, but also to political careers. And so, as I said, it's hard not to think of America today when there's a moment of hope, a dawning of something better. But that shows you the other way of doing politics, not the way of Donald Trump, which is pandering to fear and to vision, and to this idea of the white community being replaced and of missing out, which is, it's easy to get a reaction, but it's a very destructive way of going. It's much better instead to find the higher ground and inspire people like Macron to rise to leadership, to the challenge of leadership, and to live up to the values that they say that they stand for. That's the challenge of politics. Democracy is often very frustrating in this respect, but we need to find a way to encourage and to inspire whilst applying pressure. Just berating is not going to do it, though. It's a fine balance.
We'll have to leave as a final comment as the clock has gotten the best of us. We appreciate Greg, Abdennour, and Raphael for taking their time out and for sharing their expertise with us. We're talking there about these 36 or so organizations around the world which have approached the United Nations Human Rights Council complaining about France, saying that it is in fact going against international law in the way it is structurally racist towards its own Muslim citizens. That's very important to say. These are citizens of the country, but they are being treated as second-class citizens, seemingly, by the system. Is it, as our guest there mentioned, just politically smart right now, politically, at this point, astute to be going against Muslims, considering that is the wave that is going around many of these Western countries around the world? Does Macron not really have any Islamophobic views? Is he just doing this for his own political career? That seems to be the argument that is most put forward, especially considering the rise of the right also in France, as in with the rest of Europe. Will outside pressure work? Macron has not reacted to that well in the past when it came to media pressure on the country, so we'll have to wait and see how the country reacts to the Human Rights Council, and if it does bring up this topic for further debate and discussion in that country. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.